Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. So today, this afternoon, I'd like to talk with you some about the aspect of suicide contagion. I remember when I first began to work in this area, so my boss was one of the first biological child psychiatrists, Kim Pugenic, and he didn't think too much of this issue, which I was trying to study. And I worked on a grant, and he said, not so important. And so my third child was born, and I was on paternity leave. And there was a suicide cluster in a high school. And he called me up and he said, you need to get back to work. And I said, I'm on paternity leave, and besides, you said this wasn't important. And I won't repeat what he said next, but I took that as an agreement that it was important. So I'd like to talk first about what the frequency and what are the risk factors that predispose to suicide clusters, and then the things that may predispose to suicide clusters in terms of media are traditional media and social media. There's an E missing, but and then the role of peer-to-peer contact, and then what steps we might take to prevent or at least attenuate the risk of imitative suicide. So if we wanted a short version of this lecture, the answer is yes. There is evidence of time-space clustering, and there is an increase in suicide rates after media publicity. We also know that suicide and suicidal behavior are more common in both familial and non-familial social networks, although that could be because people who have psychopathology tend to befriend others with psychopathology, and it isn't necessarily evidence of imitation. This comes from work that Madeline Gould did quite some time ago, but it's still the best work that's been done. And she used a statistical method that originally was used to demonstrate that Burkitt's lymphoma had a viral etiology, which is by looking at the time, whether the distribution of cases in time and space could be explained, is due to chance, or how likely it would be that this is due to chance. And so then she can identify things that at least statistically would be considered suicide clusters. And you can see that that these are much more prominent in adolescents and young adults, and that the period of time when you see an increased risk is in the first month, with the biggest effect, at least in adolescents, in the first week after the exposure. And we know now that there's an increase in suicide rates following media exposure, and these are not just cases that are brought forward, because if so, then after that you expect there to be a drop in the suicide rate. But what happens is there's a blip and then it comes kind of back to baseline. So these are probably new cases. That the increase is proportional to the amount of publicity, and it's greater for celebrity suicides, where presumably you would identify more with them. And that the impact is half as great if the negative aspects of the suicide are emphasized, and that non-fictional stories rather than fictional stories are more likely to elicit imitation. And there's also evidence of imitation by method. So at one time, newspapers were the main way that people got their information, and in general, those studies showed that the peak impact was in the first 2 weeks after the story. Again, it's proportional to the amount of publicity, and it's more likely to occur if there are details. Imitation is more likely to occur if there are details provided about the method, and the more famous the person is, the more likely there is to be imitation. Now, Madeline Gould did a study more recently where she used the statistical method to identify suicide clusters throughout the United States. And then she had a team to interview all the members, the families of the members of these suicide clusters, and then she had a way of identifying control suicides that occurred by themselves without any evidence of being part of a cluster. And what she found was that one of the main differences between the clusters and the singleton suicides had to do with the number of stories about the index case, whether or not it was on the front page, whether it described the method, and used either the word suicide or the method in the headline, and that it provided a lot of details about the decedent. There was, this is one of the classic studies to show evidence of imitation by method. There was like a 2-week television series on that involved people committing suicide by jumping in front of subways. I guess there were a lot of subways in Vienna. I don't know, but and people were upset about this, and so they then kind of put a ban or severely restricted the amount of publicity they could give to these subway suicides, and subsequently there was a decline in suicide by that method. There's also evidence that fictional docudramas, I guess the more recently is the 13 Reasons Why, but there have been stories like this, for many years. And there were 3 of them that were aired, in a fairly short period of time. And Madeline Gould looked at whether there was evidence of an increase in suicide attempts and suicide subsequent to airing the victim, airing the story. And so this was published in the New England Journal, I think in 1986. But what you can see is that now the second story, the timing overlapped with the after of the first story, so you really couldn't get a baseline. But one of the things that you can see is that in the other stories there was a significant increase both in attempts and in suicide after the stories were aired compared to before. And there was, again, there's another classic study that looked at news stories about individuals who had killed themselves, and they showed an increase in suicides, particularly in adolescents, subsequent to the showing of it. I remember when I was started this work in Pennsylvania, there was I think he was a treasurer of Pennsylvania, and he had been arrested or was going to be arrested for corruption, and he shot himself on TV. And the station continued to air the story showing him actually killing himself. It was really kind of shocking, but that elicited a really big increase. And again, here you see there's a dose response between the amount of publicity and that teens are more vulnerable. This was an interesting study that took individuals, some of whom were suicidal and some not, and had them watch the movie Night Mother, which I've never seen, but it's about, the whole story is about this individual who is contemplating killing herself, and I think she does in the end. And then they looked at the change in suicidal intensity before and after the movie. And in general, the median level of suicidality was higher in the suicidal individuals. What you can see is that there was a wide spread, and there were certainly non-suicidal individuals who ended up being more suicidal than the average suicidal individuals. And what they showed is that that it had to do with the extent to which the person identified with the protagonist in the show. The more that they identified with it, the more vulnerable they were to increasing with regard to suicidality. Now, more and more people get their information from social media, and we used to talk about time-space clusters, but people can get information about individuals and even be communicating with individuals about suicidality, in different continents. But there's evidence that people will share and comment about suicides that have already been publicized. They may share thoughts about suicide on social media. They may do searches about suicide, either related to how to kill yourself or how to get help. And then there's also the impact of social media use on suicidal risk. And then there also are potentially positive aspects of social media use. So, first of all, there's growing evidence that there is a distinct digital footprint or fingerprint for suicidal people. If you look at the content in Twitter and Tumblr, to social media platforms, that people who are suicidal or depressed show much higher prevalence of those themes in their postings than do individuals who do not have those difficulties. And using natural language processing, there's also the style of expression is different, that it tends to be more self-referential, that there are very prominent themes of loneliness, of self-loathing, of rejection and poor body image. And in one Korean study where there's a lot of academic pressure for kids, there was concern about academic failure. So in theory, you could use this information to identify people who are at risk. And in terms of contagion, as I just mentioned, the contagion no longer would necessarily be geographic. It would more be networked by who's either reading information or in touch with one another. And there have been several studies that have shown that there's an increase in suicides after a celebrity suicide, and that this seems to be mediated by the degree to which there are social media postings about the suicide. And one of the scariest findings is that individuals who are suicidal tend to be more tightly networked with other suicidal individuals. And I don't understand the math, but this is supposed to represent what they found. But basically they looked at all these pairwise relationships and found that the individuals, you can read the article, maybe you'll get it better than me, but the bottom line is that the individuals who were suicidal had a network that was more exclusively made up of people who were suicidal, and their degrees of communication with each other were greater than non-suicidal individuals. And that's kind of scary if you're worried about the issue of contagion. There could potentially be reinforcing or setting each other off. There also now are studies about the general effect of the internet on use, on risk. That kids, I've seen another study that says at least 2 hours a day are more at risk for suicidal ideation. And one of these studies, the Hockby study, was longitudinal and seemed to indicate that the more you use it over time, the more suicidal you get, rather than showing that suicidal individuals are more likely to use the internet, although that may also be true. And the mechanism seemed to be that people use the internet, close to bedtime, and there's something about the wavelength of light that off of the screen. You can put a filter on it, but that wavelength is something that suppresses melatonin. And not only that, but sometimes the material they're reading is upsetting, which also would interfere with sleep. And finally, they're doing this instead of sleeping. And also, not surprisingly, kids who are actually addicted to internet use are more likely to show suicidal ideation. And so the other mechanism besides the problem with sleep are that kids engage in social comparison and feel wanting. That the more kids are on the internet, the more likely they are to be cyberbullied. And it's a bit weird. You would think like if somebody was being cyberbullied, they would get off the internet and stop using it. But they, that just doesn't seem to be the case. They just seem to continue to engage in this. And that they're more likely to be doing searches related to suicide. And the one thing that seems to moderate the relationship between internet use and these deleterious effects is the amount of family monitoring and support. Now, some of the family monitoring is things like, you're being bullied, we're shutting down your account. But what this study showed is that just getting support and having the parent knowledgeable about it, even given the exposure, it's less deleterious than it is if the parent doesn't know what's going on. And that's found in almost every health risk behavior. And in fact, there are studies, I think there's one study that showed that, if people eat their dinners together, then their kids are less likely to be on the internet so much, and they're less likely to be bullied and less likely to have negative effects if they are bullied. So I think it's an indication of family involvement and support. But this is one of the mechanisms that seems to mediate the relationship between social media use and suicidal ideation. And in addition, these kids, go online, get victimized, and then don't sleep as well. Now, there are positive effects, or at least they're theoretically positive effects of social media. And these are more qualitative. They'll ask people, did they find it helpful? It's not so much showing, a decline in suicidal ideation as a result of using these media. But there's discussion boards where people who are suicidal can support one another, where they kind of watch out for one another. There's the use of crisis text, which isn't social media exactly, but kids won't call, at least in the United States, they won't call a crisis line, but they will text one. And then, there are online treatments for depression and suicidality and insomnia that in theory, if people, took advantage of them, they could be helpful. And then there's the extent to which people may derive social support from social media. And I forget the reference, but there was a study that showed that people derive social support from Facebook, which I know a lot of kids don't use anymore, but if they were active in commenting on other people's postings, that the people kind of just went on and watched, who were not engaged, those people did not derive any positive support from their experience. And I guess it makes sense, it's one thing to have a friend, quote unquote. It's another thing to have your friend says, you wish them a happy birthday, or they post something and you say it's funny. You are more engaged than if you're just sort of sitting there lurking and watching and not being involved. So I think the implications for clinicians are, one, we have to ask kids about their use. And we have to encourage parents to set guidelines for internet use. And I think some of this has to happen in primary care. In other words, it's harder to have this conversation with a 16-year-old that's had a cell phone for a year. It's easier to say to an 11-year-old or 12-year-old or however old people are here when they get their phone, to say, if you want to use this phone, I have to know what's on it. I have to know what you're using it for. And, if you use it too much, I'm going to take it away. It's much easier to have that conversation before you give them the phone than afterwards. And I think that we need to ask our patients when they're using it and try and figure out, is this affecting their sleep, and are they being bullied, things like that, which can, have a profound effect on their clinical status. And to be honest, until I started taking a look at this, I never asked any questions about this. I don't know how many people here are dealing clinically with adolescents, how many people routinely ask kids about their social media use? Well, you're making me feel a little better, but I think we should. I think it's a pretty big effect. They spend a lot of time there, and the worst comes to worst, you find out, and it's inconsequential. But if you have a kid who's being bullied, who's not getting sleep, it's going to be very difficult to kind of proceed with whatever therapy you're doing if you don't address those issues. So now I'd like to transition to studies that look at actual what happens to kids who are exposed to suicide. And one of the things that is consistent across studies is that kids who are exposed to suicide or suicidal behavior are not exposed at random. That kids who are exposed to suicide have more psychopathology, they've had more exposure in the past, and they have more previous suicidal ideation and behavior. So that you have to be careful to disentangle. You can say, oh, here's exposure and here's the outcome, but you have to disentangle the fact that the exposure occurs because of their risk, as compared to that it causes the risk. It could do both, and people made this mistake when they were studying post-traumatic stress disorder, and for a while, at least when I was a resident, we were taught that having substance abuse or a disruptive disorder was a risk factor for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not. It's a risk factor for exposure to traumatic events, which then leads to PTSD. But the risk factors for PTSD are more previous trauma and anxiety disorders. That those are risk factors for the exposure, not for developing the outcome, given that you have the exposure. And so this is a study, I think, that was done there are two studies. One was done in Hong Kong and one in Taiwan. I don't remember which is which, but they looked at the peers of kids who died by suicide, who were attempters, and then who were unexposed. And they found a risk, that their risk for suicidal acts, and that wasn't so well defined in this study, was increased in the friends of attempters and to a lesser degree in the suicide completers. But you didn't find it in people who were close friends of either the attempters or the completers. And this is consistent with the work that Maddie Gould did when she was looking at the suicide clusters. And I think when we first started working in this area, we began thinking, probably the close friends are the ones who are going to be most vulnerable to this. They're going to be the most affected. They have the biggest exposure. But it turns out that if you look at the characteristics of the individuals in the suicide clusters, they knew of the person, but they weren't close friends, actually. And, although, we're reasoning backwards now, the issue, as we'll talk about, is that somebody who is not a close friend of somebody who kills themselves, they may not go to the funeral. They may not see, the parents weeping and inconsolable. All they know is everybody's talking about it, like for weeks. And if I do it, people will talk about me. So I think the close friends see the cost as well as, the supposed benefits. Whereas somebody who's more distant, similar to like somebody reading about a celebrity or something, can kind of imagine that the benefit outweighs the risk. Okay, well, this is the Hong Kong one. You have sort of a similar finding. In this case, there was an effect for attempts but not suicide completions. And perhaps you're talking about the same issue, that with somebody who makes a suicide attempt and survives, and they get more social support, this might seem like a better deal than actually killing yourself. In that study, what they were able to demonstrate is that exposure to a suicide attempt was much more, had much more of an effect in terms of suicidal risk if they were already depressed. And this is a study that looked at exposure to peer suicide and shows an increase in all kinds of health risk behaviors. And we should remember that but the question is, do they have them before the exposure? In our studies, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, what we found is that one of the things that put you at risk for having a friend who killed themselves is if you had an alcohol abuse disorder. And so you might have the same thing, you have binge drinking problems, you're more likely to be exposed to somebody who killed themselves because they probably also had a drinking problem. And there's a fascinating study that I just came across, which I think the paper was called The Power of Misperception. So in all these other studies, we just took it for granted that if a kid said they were exposed to a suicide attempt, they were. And in this study, what they did is they had people nominate up to 10 friends, and they asked them whether or not they had made a suicide attempt. And through their research methodology, they then were able to verify in those friends whether they'd actually made an attempt. And anyway, this was their another indecipherable graph, but this shows the way they kind of mapped out these social networks. And you're free to look at that slide and try and figure it out. But what they found is that that kids who were suicide attempters were more likely to overestimate. They were more likely to report that their friends had made a suicide attempt when they hadn't. And they were less accurate about saying that their friend hadn't made they were less accurate in saying that kid hadn't made a suicide attempt when they had. And so the Model 3 is really what we should look at, but with Model 1, if you just asked, have you been exposed to a suicide attempt, it gives you about a 4-fold increased risk of an attempt. However, if you control for if you look at the risk factor as whether or not they overestimated that their friends had made an attempt, they had a 5-fold risk, but actually being accurate only gave them a 2.5-fold risk. So I think this is just an interesting point that it has something to do with their perception of their friend's behavior as compared to what actually happened. So to summarize this set of studies, that kids who are exposed to suicidal behavior, they're already at increased psychosocial risk. And that the exposure to suicide attempt more so than suicide seems to increase the risk of imitation. That youth who are already vulnerable, particularly with depression, are more vulnerable to the deleterious effects of exposure. That close friends seem less likely to imitate. And that the exposure is somehow also associated with increased health risk behaviors, although we don't know whether those antedated the exposure. And the limitations of these studies are they were cross-sectional, they relied only on self-report and not on interviews. They didn't really ascertain the degree of exposure, and most of them didn't control for pre-existing risk factors. And there was kind of a wide range of what people meant when they referred to suicidal behavior. And so we did this study some time ago, but most of these studies antedated this project. But this study we referred to as YES, or Youth Exposed to Suicide. And we had the idea that if we looked at the peers who were exposed to suicide, looked at their social networks, we might be able to understand who was at risk for imitation and also who was who was at risk for imitation. So we started with a teen who killed themselves, and we interviewed the siblings. They usually had about one sib. We looked at 3 close friends, and then we asked those friends to nominate other friends of the victim who were less close to them than they were. And so we ended up interviewing about 7 people in their social network. And then we went to another community where there hadn't been a suicide for 2 years, but was demographically similar. And we knocked on people's doors, which you couldn't really do these days. And we asked them to participate, and they filled out a CBCL. And then we matched the unexposed people who on CBCL to these exposed kids. And so we ended up with 26 suicides in their social network. There were 146 friends, 146 controls. There were 34 kids where their parents wouldn't give us permission. We did eventually follow them up. Once they turned 18, we called them, and actually all of them participated. And then we had 25 siblings, and we followed them for 3 years. And so again, the first thing we found is that these kids were more likely to have psychopathology prior to the exposure. You can see that they were about twice as likely to have a psychiatric disorder, more likely to have depression, conduct disorder, drug and alcohol abuse, and prior exposure to suicidal behavior. There are also higher rates of family divorce and psychiatric disorder, and so this was a vulnerable group. And to be honest, we were completely unprepared for the severity of this kid's reactions. We thought, like, okay, you lose a brother or a sister or a child, that's really awful. You lose a friend, I mean, it's sad, but these kids were really devastated, and we'll talk about that in a sec. And I think what was going on is these kids were alienated from their families, and their valence for their friendships their friendships were much more important to them than the average person, kid who had aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends. So this is what happened in the first 6 months after exposure. You had a really high rate of depression in these kids and PTSD. You had an increased incidence of suicidal ideation, but not of attempts. Some of that is the sample size, but and in addition, the kids who developed depression were more likely to have additional interpersonal losses, to have had a family history of mood disorder and a previous history of depression. So we're seeing the same thing as the previous studies, that exposure doesn't affect people evenly, but is more likely to have negative sequelae if you're already vulnerable. So we divided kids to whether they had at least one risk factor for depression. And what you can see is in the kids who didn't have any risk factors of depression, exposure to suicide really didn't make much difference. But you can see there was quite a big effect if they had at least one risk factor. And so we looked at the nature of their relationships, to see if we could discern anything about what led to their having such a strong reaction. And they were more likely to be depressed if they had a close and confiding relationship to the victim, if they had talked to the victim within 24 hours, if they felt they could have done something to prevent the suicide, and this is the biggie, if they knew the plans of the suicide victim. And in defense of these kids, this study was done a couple decades ago, and the zeitgeist at that time was, boy, you never rat on your friends. You would never go to an adult about something like this. I think now kids would be more likely to go and talk to somebody if they had a friend who was talking about suicide, but at that time, people believed if you talk about suicide, you're certainly not going to do it. But anyway, they were really devastated afterwards, as one might understand. And if they had witnessed the suicide or found the body or saw the scene, they were more likely to develop depression. And they also had an increased incidence of PTSD. So substance abuse was a risk factor. I know I said it really isn't, but I think here it was probably a risk factor for exposure. A family history of anxiety disorder, and history of other losses before the PTSD made them more vulnerable. And again, having a close relationship with the victim, finding the body, and feeling the suicide was preventable was associated with kids who developed PTSD. And when we looked at the siblings, the pattern was pretty similar, increased depression and PTSD. What's interesting, I don't think I have a slide to show this, but in the long-term follow-up, the siblings did better than the friends. The siblings showed resolution of these conditions, within a year, whereas many of the friends of suicide victims were ill throughout the follow-up period, in spite of the fact that we gave them, referrals and things like that. And the study wasn't really designed to figure out why that happened, but in our own opinion, the issue is that if you lose a sibling, you have a funeral, you have a mourning process, you have support, people recognize, that you've had this loss, and you have your family to grieve along with you. If you lose a friend, who's going to help you? They were already alienated from their families. So it turned out that for them it was a pretty lonely process. And, like me, I think a lot of people underestimated the impact on them and didn't even expect that they would be suffering to this degree. And, the same, though, profile of risk factors in the siblings who became depressed. This shows you the time course in terms of the incidence of depression in the exposed kids and in the control group. And, most of the action is in the beginning, in the first month. After that, the incidence kind of parallels them. So if you're going to do anything to help these kids, you have to get there pretty early. PTSD was a different story. They continued to have increased risk for post-traumatic stress disorder almost over the entire period of follow-up. And this is consistent with other studies that show that individuals who are traumatized will have a lower threshold for being re-traumatized and developing post-traumatic stress disorder. And the odds of developing either depression or PTSD were really elevated if they knew the victim's plans before they died. I think it's a mistake there. I think that last number shouldn't be 0.2. It's probably 10.2. But there was no short or long-term increase in suicidal behavior. And again, you probably wouldn't need a project 10 times the size to really be sure. But what's interesting is when you adjusted for the fact that the exposed kids had more risk factors for suicide attempts to begin with, even though it wasn't statistically significant, they actually had half the risk of an attempt of their friends. And so, it suggests maybe there was something protective about this experience. And when we asked kids about it, they said after seeing what the kid's family went through, what they went through, no matter how suicidal they felt, they just would never act on this. So it supports this idea about when you do publicize a suicide in the media, that it's important to show the cost, that this person, was psychiatrically ill, that, the families that are devastated afterwards, and usually to provide some information about getting help, so that it's presented not as something romantic, but as something more clinical. And these kids also had evidence of complicated grief, which I don't know how many of you were at the talk about bereavement, but this is really where we got interested in this. This study annotated our study of parents, but so you have kids who are bitter, can't move on from the loss, and in any case, it seems to be distinct from depression and anxiety. And in studies in adults, if you randomize people with complicated grief to a specific treatment that is kind of like an exposure and restructuring to interpersonal therapy, that the interpersonal therapy doesn't work for this, but the grief-specific treatment does. And we followed these kids up 6 years later, and the ones with complicated grief still, had increased incidence of ideation. And in studies, and in addition, they were more likely to be depressed and have PTSD. The kids with complicated grief in our parental bereavement study had 10% of them had complicated grief for 3 years, but 40% had it, in the first year. So this is important to assess for as well. I think I'm going to skip this, but so just to summarize, there appears to be, no evidence of increased imitation among the close friends of suicide victims. Within 1 month, there was an increased risk for depression and for PTSD, with the latter continuing to accrue more cases over time. That these kids were at risk for psychopathology prior to their exposure, and that complicated grief can also ensue and that it can contribute to suicidal risk, and that the nature of their relationship, whether they witnessed the suicide and feeling they could have prevented it, particularly knowing the plans of the victim, all can affect their risk for depression and PTSD. And I just want to mention a more recent study, very elegant study of suicide clustering. This is from the Army STAR study. It's a massive project done in the United States Army, looking at trying to understand why the suicide rate is elevated among members of the armed forces, which traditionally was never the case. Traditionally, if anything, their rate was lower. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't really know why it's higher. But in any case, what they did is they looked within units to ask the question, if a suicide attempt occurred in a unit, is there an increased risk for the other people engaging in an attempt? And what they did find was there was an increased risk of an attempt. There was a dose response. I mean, I think it was something like if there were at least 5 attempts, then, the likelihood was greater. But they also found that the effect was much more prominent in smaller units, which would make sense. What you don't know, because this was using administrative data, is, was it related to unit climate? Were there's bullying? Did they have a tyrannical, squadron leader? I mean, he could either have been, really destructive, or he could have been more sympathetic, and they were more likely to disclose that they made an attempt. We don't know those kind of things. But this shows you that the blue line, the dark blue line, is the incidence of suicide attempts in the unit, in these units, and you can see that it's elevated, particularly in those units that are 40 or smaller. But that you're really seeing a significant increase when you have at least 3 or 4 attempts. So you have to ask yourself, what's going on in a unit of 40 or smaller that has 4 or 5 suicide attempts? So it's interesting, but it also, this raises as many questions as it addresses. So what should a community do when there's a teen suicide? And so this is what my boss called me back to deal with. So the most important thing is that you have to have a plan in place before a crisis occurs. And it usually involves some collaboration between schools and some people with mental health expertise. And everybody you need to know who's in charge, who's going to be calling the shots, who's talking to the media, who's talking to the family, and who's responsible for what. And there isn't a right answer to how it should be done, except that there should be an answer. And And it's important to provide clear information to students about what happened and make sure that they know about any available services. And so, on the basis of these studies, it seems like we decided that there, and I think many people follow these guidelines. We know that the friends of suicide victims are vulnerable, so they should be screened. If there are kids who are known to the school to have psychiatric problems, they should be screened. And then we let people know anybody else who's upset, we will, we're available and we'll screen them. And then the school has to do what it needs to get activities back to normal. We strongly advise them, not to have a memorial, not to put something on the kids' locker room, and so on and so forth. So that's the broad strokes for what we would recommend and what we've done. It's very difficult to evaluate, is this a good idea or not? But it is based on research, based on the research that we've done, other people have done, it seems logical to me. So just to summarize, cluster suicides do occur. They constitute about 1 to 5% of all suicides in youth. That the imitation is most likely to occur within 10 days. That media publicity can increase imitation. That it's proportional to the fame of the victim, to the amount of publicity, to the specificity of description of the method, and to the degree to which the article emphasizes the positive aspects of the suicide and the suicide victim. People have come up with guidelines for responsible media coverage, which, people follow to less or greater degree, but that you want to limit the amount of coverage. You want to emphasize that suicide is not romantic, that it stems from mental illness, and that intervention and prevention are possible. That if it makes sense to report on the negative aftermath of the suicide, not to discuss the method in detail, and to provide some numbers for distressed individuals to get help. That the screening for youth who are exposed to a peer suicide, that you want to know about past disorder, specifically depression, suicidal ideation and behavior, PTSD, and grief, and that you'll take a look at relationship issues, family history of disorder, and other stressors and losses. So, you kind of have a stripped down assessment, because you're going in there, you may have a lot of kids to screen, and you have to focus on, things that are going to give you some yield. You want to know if they've been exposed to the death scene or witnessed it, whether they knew the plans of the victim and have a sense of responsibility. And for kids who are having difficulty, it's a good idea to follow up with them, say, in a couple of weeks, because it's difficult to tell right then, the difference between somebody who's upset and somebody who's depressed. And then, when you have determined that they have depression or PTSD, they need to be treated. In general, I would say that often their parents are also ill, and if they're treated, they may do, the kids may do better. And that you want to assess and deal with the issues of complicated grief as well. And also address the cognitive distortions that kids may have about feeling responsible for the death. I think we've covered this. And I think we've already really summarized what we talked about. So I think we have some time for questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you, and hope this has been helpful. Thanks. Questions? You guys need coffee? Okay. Well, if you have questions, I'll be here if you want to ask me after the